Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm excited to be back again today with my friend Andrew McKee, Umbrex member, and he leads the Headland Strategy Group, a boutique consulting firm focused on life science industry. Andrew, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Will. Great to be here.
Last time, Andrew, we talked about more, kind of all the cool stuff you do around like personal and professional development, and had a great discussion. We didn't focus so much on, your firm and your consulting, but about your jazz and your writing and all the other cool stuff. So we'll include a link to that episode in the show notes. But today, you had offered so kindly to give me a bit of a overview of the biotech industry, which I don't know a ton about. So, and we're going to, I think, distinguish that some of what's different or the same versus pharma. What do people mean by pharma tech? So let's start with that. What is biotech, Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, Will. And before I answer your question, I just want to give you a shout out in the Umbrex community. It's such a great sign of a healthy community when we can really be ourselves and talk about that openly, because as someone who's dabbled in all these different things and self-healing in different ways, it's great to be able to talk about those things as well as professional and realize there are many false boundaries we have in life, and it's all part of our lives. So thank you for having a great community. Yeah, to answer your question, so what is biotech? I generally think of it as it's basically pharma, or one way to think of it is innovative pharma. It means biotechnology. As my team helpfully reminded me, though, there are these days emerging three categories of biotech. There's the sort of therapeutics or medicines part of biotech. There's agricultural biotech, and then there's also industrial biotech. In our firm, and probably hopefully, because I can only comment on the first of the three with any credibility. We don't work in the other two sectors too much, with the exception of industrial applications that are basically biotech for making better medicines. So biotech generally means using living systems or biology to make new medicines. I think probably encompasses making new diagnostics as well, but that's the basic concept. It used to mean a certain class of companies that use these living systems to make new medicines more or less exclusively, but that changed roughly 10 to 20 years ago when it became really mainstream. And basically nowadays, every pharma company we know of does biotech. And so biotech, the sort of, again, this is maybe a long etymological answer to your question, but biotech now kind of has a connotation of meaning like an early stage innovative company using these cutting edge tools. So I'll stop there, see if I answer your question or if I can explain more.
That's great. So, with just a detour, we'll focus on more the medicine type biotech, but what would agricultural biotech or industrial biotech be? That would be something related to making some kind of additive to the soil or something for agriculture, or making some kind of textiles with biology for industrial. Like, what are you talking about for those two things?
Exactly, yeah. So agricultural could be like looking at new types of pesticides, say that are more naturally sort of biologic in origin, and maybe again from the end consumer perspective, people would be more comfortable with the idea of, say, some kind of natural microbe that's like killing something that would otherwise eat a plant, rather than like having a genetically modified plant that they're going to eat. Maybe the plant's normal and organic, but again, maybe that doesn't. Again, I'm a little out of my league. I don't know if that would qualify for organic putting, but that's the sort of like cutting edge ways to solve problems that you have with crops. Again, I'll speak at my sort of, you know, mostly from read in newspapers, right? But you talk about like the crop yield, you talk about crop susceptibility to pests, like things like these that are really important both in developing countries and developed countries. So that's my hand wavy way of saying that's what's going on in agricultural uh, universe. And then on the industrial, yeah, like the example you gave was a great one, like using whether it's bacteria, other types of cells, other living systems to produce materials in new ways. Could be like new kinds of plastics, yeah, and all sorts of examples. But yeah, it could be plastics and textiles, like you mentioned. It could be like extruding to a thread. It could be other kinds of materials where there's some kind of leg up that the biological system gives you, either from the, again, for instance, the high sophistication of what's being created or the high consistency. Um, just, yeah, there's just a few examples.
Okay. Or I imagine you sometimes hear about, the bacteria that they release that eat up the oil slick or whatever. I guess we might.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Like this bioremediation is a great example. And there, unfortunately, I can't think of a I'm blank on the top of my head of a good example, but I won't mention the company by name. But there's a company that recently went public claiming to reinvent a lot of manufacturing with biosystems, but then yeah, had a lot of negative press recently, so I won't give them a hard time publicly. But it's definitely in the news. Is like it's the same thing in, again, give a historical aside how pharma has evolved. It used to be, we found cool medicines largely from nature, isolated from plants, and or learned about through Native Americans and other traditional cultures, that there was, medicinal promise in a molecule. And then we brought this in the, I'm generalizing a lot, but in the 20th century, brought the manufacturing skills to bear to say, okay, well, and chemistry know-how to say, how can we optimize this molecule so maybe it lasts longer or it doesn't have as many side effects, this kind of thing. And then the next revolution, again, I'm hand wavy here, but roughly in the 1980s is when the biotech stuff came along and said, well, we could, instead of building the molecule or the drug in, in reactors and doing a chemical reaction, what if we had biology do it for us? So maybe we have a kind of bacteria that can actually make the medicine in their cells and then spit it out, and then we collect that and put it into the vat and make the drug. That's kind of the crux. And I'm being very simplistic. So the crux again is like, how can we use the elements of bacteria, for instance, doesn't have to be bacteria, to make new things? That's, again, I mean, 30,000-foot view, but that's my understanding. Yeah.
All right, cool. Could you go through and do a bit of a side by side compare and contrast of the kind of a biotech company and the functions that it does versus a more traditional pharma type product? And maybe we think about the different dimensions, like initial drug discovery or clinical trials or the approval process or the marketing. I don't know if there's some areas that are pretty similar or some areas that are very different in terms of how that function happens and so forth. Like I've heard, but that generics in the biotech world are a very different thing because it's actually much harder maybe to kind of just copy something if it's produced by a biological system. But just kind of walk us through that framework of compare and contrast.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Will. Yeah, I'll do my best. I think the critical difference between biotech and pharma is one of scale, because they're basically companies doing the same thing with a different scale. So, and again, because these are words sort of being used with context and connotation. So, generally speaking, a biotech firm is going to be smaller. It could cover anything from a startup all the way to a company with, let's say, a few drugs in clinical trials. And to put some rough numbers around it, generally speaking, you're a small to medium size or mid cap company. Again, investment bankers may slightly disagree, but I usually think of it as like mid cap gets you to around, you're in the sort of $3 to $10 billion market cap range is sort of a mid cap. And then you get any bigger than that, again, I'm not being overly precise here, but you start to get into pharma size territory. And so the pharmas are basically also, so they're both inventing medicines. So compare and contrast. We're talking about companies, and I'm going to speak generally. I'll answer your question about generics, biosimilars, but first maybe we'll scope it into talking about the premium pharma space or the branded pharma. So these are companies whose whole mission is to invent new medicines that don't exist or never existed before as marketed products. And so in that context, biotech and pharma are doing the same thing. They're both doing R&D, research and development, to invent and bring to market new drugs. And then they're actually doing the marketing of those drugs. With the caveat, and this is where I'll say some differences. So biotechs generally don't have the scale to do a few things that pharma companies do. One is manufacturing at large scale. The second would be commercial, like marketing and sales, and working with the appropriate distribution partners to do that. And then what's the other? Yeah, those are the two main functions that generally are a big reason why there's so many deals in our industry. And I can talk at more length of that, but you have deals at a single drug, or sometimes it's called an asset level, because the biotechs are often innovating, but they don't have, again, the either the human capital, the physical capital, like actual factories, and sometimes know-how to further manufacture and commercialize. And there's no hard and fast rule, but generally as drugs, and we'll probably go into this in a moment, but as drugs advance in the clinical trial progression towards getting a regulatory approval, usually when they get to phase 2 or phase 3 is when smaller companies either start to look for a large pharma partner for all the reasons I mentioned, or they look to get bought out because maybe they don't want to do it on a single asset. They want to exit and get acquired. So that's the premium space in a nutshell. Is basically, again, biotech are smaller companies, pharma are larger ones. One other nuance I want to point out is that it's still the case that a lot of medicines are traditional. I shouldn't say traditional, but like their chemistry, they're like small molecules, as we'd say, as the chemists would say, meaning that there are things that you can manufacture at scale with a traditional large-scale chemical synthesis in a big factory, and not with any biology necessarily. But even those companies today are called biotech because they're using all sorts of cool tools in their research labs, and to understand how the drugs would work, even if it's a traditional small molecule. And yeah, so I'll stop there. I'll see if I answer your question, then I'll come to generics and biosimilars.
Yeah, that's helpful. So it sounds like the definitions have shifted a bit so that it's more about almost the scale and size of the company and how innovative it is. So smaller, more innovative companies using more cutting edge technology, we'll call those a biotech, regardless of the size of the molecule that they're working on.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
And yes. And maybe it might be helpful also definitionally to talk about, like, when we talk about kinds of drugs that we would consider biotech, it might be helpful to, since I mentioned small molecules, there are a lot of categories of drugs that can fall into what we call biotech. And some are antibodies, where these are like engineered versions of what we use in our immune system, but designed to attack usually bad things in our body, but not always. Sometimes they're designed to specifically push on something, so to speak, that makes something go better in a biological system. But they're antibodies. There can be increasingly there are cell therapies, where these are cells that are given to a patient to treat their disease. There are also vaccines are usually counted within the biologicals. So those are just a few examples. And then, sorry, gene therapy would be another one, which sometimes is done in concert with modifying cells. So you might modify cells, say outside a patient's body, and then with gene therapy and other types of genetic tools, and then give it to the patient. And also there is gene therapy as its own category, where you would just increasingly give it as a therapy and expect that it would modify and improve something in the patient's cells directly.
So a lot of us have circulating in our bodies the Moderna, in fact, Pfizer, Moderna. Would Moderna be counted as a biotech company? And
yes, absolutely. So yeah, that's another sort of could potentially include that within gene therapy, the mRNA therapeutics. So yes, so that's a great example where in the case of Moderna and the Pfizer BioNTech vaccines, they have the patient is getting mRNA that's and it's protected in a lipid nanoparticle to make sure it lives, so to speak, or lasts long enough in your bloodstream to have impact. And then it will get into cells, and the cells will produce from that mRNA, which is like one of the key instructions. Also to back up, so as a mini lesson of how proteins are created, we have DNA, which provides the instructions that gets transcribed into RNA, and then the messenger RNA, and then the mRNA gets translated into proteins in the cells. So you basically have cells getting a new mRNA strand that then they use, and they start to convert that into protein. That's going to then produce proteins from parts of the coronavirus that'll then be recognized by our immune system. And as we've seen, fortunately in these cases, then your body will create a very robust response to those triggers. So yeah, that's in a nutshell what's going on. Obviously, I'm skipping over, hopefully not making the scientists in your audience groan too much, but skipping over a lot of details there.
Okay. What are some of the differences in manufacturing between one of these biotech type of drugs, whether antibodies, cell therapies, vaccines, gene therapy, manufacturing those versus manufacturing the more traditional small molecule? Is it like a much different set of capabilities or set of equipment or set of expertise?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, all of the above. So take something like antibodies, for instance, which is an easy one to start with. Um, those are typically produced through bacterial cells that have been modified to essentially have each bacterial cell become its own little antibody factory. So you're commandeering, again, we'll talk about that same machinery of how RNA can be made into protein. You're commandeering that machinery to basically force the cells to pump out a ton of extra protein that they normally would not do, and have it ideally be almost exclusively antibody material. So you can there's some mammalian cells that are used. There's a Chinese hamster ovary cells that are also really commonly used to produce antibodies. So yeah, so you have to have the know-how to know how to build up, again, like so you might have a large vat basically of bacteria that are pumping out protein, and then you have the downstream manufacturing processes to to take the protein that's in solution, take it downstream, and then you filter out any impurities, because again, these are like biological systems. There could be other proteins that the bacteria are spitting out you don't want. The proteins themselves could be breaking. Hopefully this doesn't happen a lot, but they could break, or they could glom onto each other in a way that is not good. So you have basically a lot of high specificity filtration methods later to get out only the active ingredient, which would be the antibody you're trying to make, and make sure you're not getting all these weird variants that could be very at the least just be impurities, but at the worst could actually have a really awful consequence to the patient. So so yeah, I'm not sure if I answered. Basically, if you're looking at, like, say, doing projects in manufacturing, you need to have people who have expertise at doing that kind of manufacturing, rather than the small molecule chemistry type of manufacturing.
And what about the delivery device or delivery mechanism for the drug? A few years ago, I had a project where I went to this convention of like pharma suppliers, and I was kind of amazed by the variety of companies that focus just on drug delivery, methodologies. Do those tend to be different between small molecule and these more complex molecules?
Yeah, great questions. Thanks, Will. Let's see. It does. There are a few variables involved. Part of it could be the type of molecule. We can come back to that. I'll try to give the high level first. Part of it could be the end organ or end cell type you're trying to affect, and how to get there. And then I guess a third part might just be the disease process itself. And then the fourth consideration would be a patient convenience, but also like meeting the patient's needs the best. So if I take them in turn, so small molecules, they generally have the advantage that you can take, not always, but you can usually take them by mouth, like that's why we have like pills, and we'll digest them, and it'll get into our blood system and get to every organ in the body through the bloodstream. Usually that's good, although there are some companies that will, I'll come back to special cases, but that's generally the situation. Whereas with biologics, like we're talking about, let's say mRNA, if you eat those, as though you had a pill, you're basically your stomach and your small intestine are going to rip it to shreds into like basic building blocks and treat it like nutrition. So um, that's what our bodies do. So that's why you usually have to have a vaccine or some of these other biologics injected, either say into the muscle, kind of slowly spread out in your muscle and get into your system. That's like many vaccines are like that, or go straight into the like an IV, which intravenously, meaning that someone has to set up a needle into your vein and get the medicine in that way. And a lot of cutting edge drugs for cancer require getting directly into your veins, so you bypass the digestive system. And then the other examples would be, say, special cases like for certain eye illnesses, where you want to either inject directly into the eye, or in some cases there are drugs available that have you still inject it, but it would have like a long a long acting or a long delivering element to it. So because as you can imagine, like uh, you know having getting your eye injected is not it's not comfortable, right? And I mean, of course, the physicians make it as comfortable as they can, but the less
Wait, Andrew,
right,
Andrew,
right,
this is episode 430 something, and that is the understatement of this entire podcast, that it is uncomfortable. I have such a phobia about anything sharp getting close to my eyes. That would be like
yeah.
my
Well, I'm
greatest.
good. Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad I inadvertently gave you some good sound bites there. That yeah, because I'm with you too. I feel like I'm pretty comfortable with and I have an MD. Did not practice, but I went through a lot of medical training where I was very comfortable with like surgery, gore, trauma, and I have a pretty high stress tolerance. So it was like didn't mind, but when it came to myself around anything with my eyes or teeth, I think I'm gradually, after meditating for like almost 15 years, I'm gradually have developed skills to like deal with what's basically kind of terrifying. Yeah. So if you, like you can imagine, yeah, but again, patients, what's so tricky about some of these eye diseases, and there's like there's macular degeneration. It's just really kind of scary illnesses for a person, right? Where it's like they're looking at blindness after a certain amount of time if the disease. So there's a trade-off you're willing to make, right? It's like, again, not to be too black or white, but it's like either I get blind eventually, or I take a drug that'll help slow the progression and let me have my eyesight longer. So you're willing to make that trade-off, but that is one reason why there are a lot of drugs in some of these diseases like AMD, acute macular degeneration, that uh, the goal is to improve on the standard of care by having less and less frequent injections. And there's a number of approved drugs that are already doing that, say every 2 months instead of once a month, et cetera. But yeah, so that's an example. And again, gene therapy, since we talked about that, if you want to affect certain cells but not affect other ones, you have to be pretty strategic. So yeah, to your kind of implied question, it's like sometimes a lot of kind of biomedical engineering, like how do we get this thing to where it needs to go, or do we need new devices? And then last is, I alluded to it, but convenience is like, no one likes to take drugs, and it's hard to remember when to do them. And if you've ever, I can't quote the stats, but it's pretty striking when you look at the sort of national statistics on how people do struggle to take medicines, even if they know it's going to help them. We don't adhere to regimens. So it's nice if you could, you have a special device that maybe releases the drug over a long period of time, just makes it better for everyone involved. Yeah.
Can we talk about the organization of a pharma company as well as a biotech company in terms of the types of roles? And I think there's some functions that are somewhat specific to just life sciences. Like I hear the term medical affairs, right? And commercial may mean something very specific. Could you walk through like sort of the typical different roles that you see at a pharma company, and a biotech company, and what those mean? Some might be obvious, but there's some that I think are specific and be interesting to hear about. Like the people that deal with reimbursement, for example, the medical affairs people that deal with physicians.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah. I'll start with the biotech. Hopefully, I don't forget anything. But of course, you get a CEO, and then you have different functions. Usually, there's a head of research. Then there'll be someone who's in charge of clinical development. Usually, that person's called a chief medical officer. You often have chief operating officer, who at least for the small companies has, in my opinion, a very heterogeneous job description, at least from company to company. That person could be doing any number of things, but usually it could be a small scale portfolio management function. Sometimes that person is involved in the deal making side, although other times that could be with a chief business officer or CBO, whose responsibility is to do, again, even for the small companies, they can do inbound deals to bring in new assets, and then also be working on outbound deals, like looking for big pharma partners, for instance. Then you have some other important support functions, like you have, which can be very strategic, especially, so the CFO, so there's a finance department, and there's legal department, and of course, and then HR, right? So those are probably the main ones. I might have forgotten one or two, but so many of those are standard. I do know from working with a lot of folks who or excuse me, knowing a lot of folks like in other sectors, like CMO is not chief marketing officer like it often is in tech companies. It's chief medical officer. Yes. So let me think. So, and then as a company gets larger, they as they prepare for commercializing, they'll often then get a chief commercial officer, CCO. And yeah, to part of your question, and maybe talk about some things that are unique in pharma. Usually, you have the marketing and sales functions and any sort of brand strategy type functions reporting into the commercial branch. And then you have government affairs, or excuse me, yeah, sorry. Well, actually, we should talk about government affairs, but that was sort of a Freudian mix-up. Yeah, medical affairs, which also reports in the commercial. We can come back to government affairs. Which actually usually in a large company would also report to commercial. But medical affairs is interesting. The history of that is it evolved out of, again, this is where, I'm proud to say all of our clients are ethical, and it's something we pride ourselves on is helping, I think, on the innovative side of pharma, but unfortunately there have been some bad actors in pharma. And everyone can sort of Google the history of medical affairs, or I'm happy to share it, but basically medical affairs didn't really exist as a function until about, I believe, 10 or 15 years ago, when they're just the unsavory tactics of sales teams reached a tipping point where, again, here I'm not a lawyer, but I think a mixture of laws and regulations were passed to say that, okay, salespeople cannot do these things, and there's, but there's still a role to educate physicians and patients and other stakeholders, and that's largely the function of medical affairs. The second function, I could zoom out again, but I'm kind of going into the medical affairs since you mentioned it. The second function of medical affairs is to help. Also, it's on a, I guess I would call it on a innovation side, but it's where you have innovative clinicians, usually clinicians, but not always, at medical centers that want to do a trial, let's say in a patient population that's not been on the radar of the big pharma company. And I think one kind of cool thing about medical affairs is it's a way for pharma to collaborate with these enterprising investigators. So let's say that, again, a small patient population that the pharma company didn't have the resources to study. Well, if you're an investigator at a large academic medical center, you can basically make a proposal to a pharma company and say, hey, I'd love to test your drug in these patients, and here's the rationale. And there's a way for Med Affairs to basically supply the drug at cost with a little bit of guidance and in collaboration, but it's a collaboration with academia, and I generally am a fan of that. It gives more patients more shots on goal, so to speak, to see what might work for them. And of course, if something really works out well, it could become a branded, or it could be added to what the drug is marketed for. But at the very least, you're amplifying the number of experiments to see what could work and help patients. So anyhow, that's Med Affairs. And then zooming out, government affairs, I can't speak too much expertise there, but that's generally, I think it's sort of lobbying in another in another word, basically. But that's how big companies try to influence to their benefit with legislation and so forth. I'll stop there. What gaps can I fill in?
Yeah. So one question would be that, on the figuring out what sort of clinical trials a company wants to do, as a naive person who never had been in the industry, I might have thought, well, just they have some drug and they want to see if it cures some disease, so it's sort of straightforward. But having just done a little bit of work in pharma a long time ago, I kind of got a better sense that they'll be much more strategic about that, about designing the trial specifically so they can make some claim, and either figuring out what competitive drug they want to be compared against, or what's the endpoint, or sort of how do they want to position themselves in the market. So talk a little bit about that whole strategy for clinical trials, and how companies approach that. So they thinking about what's the market size, what's the population size, what's the reimbursement environment for that particular indication, et cetera, and how they use all that to shape and design the clinical trials that they conduct.
Yeah, thanks, Will. And yeah, and feel free to corral me if I speak at length here, because this is something that our firm does a lot within our R&D and portfolio management strategy practice, which is one of our 3 practice areas. Yeah, so at a high level, like any of these, again, we think of those as investments. It doesn't work, wouldn't say that, as patients, it doesn't sound like the right words to use, but these companies have to choose their investments, like which drugs should we take to market, and it's a huge investment to go through all these clinical trials. So usually I think at a meta level, I think about 4 key parameters always for all these R&D investments, which are what's the commercial payoff or the reward, which again so that's one. The second is the risk, and this is a high risk industry, so roughly 8 to 9 out of 10 drugs that start the clinical trial process will fail, and that's more or less held true since the day researchers started tallying those kinds of numbers of success rates. So risk is the second one. The third one would be cost, and the fourth would be timing. And so at a big level, it's not rocket science, but this is where it gets fun and challenging and interesting, is sort of think through the strategy. Back up for a moment, just provide background. Typically, drugs go through a 3-phase process. They go through phase 1, phase 2, then phase 3 trials, and then they apply for regulatory approval in any country that they want to market the future product. That's the typical paradigm. So phase 1 is typically done in healthy patients to just confirm that the drug is safe. Phase 2 then is typically in patients with a disease that the drug is intended to treat. Usually it's a small study, big enough to figure out whether or not there's a benefit from the drug. And then the phase 3 is usually then designed to be confirmatory from the phase 2. That's a simple paradigm, and a lot of exceptions come into play when there are life-threatening illnesses, where there's a high mortality rate, or it's also rare and life-threatening or really awful disease. Then you often can get some special permissions from regulatory agencies to go faster through the paradigm. For instance, you might skip phase 2. You might maybe only do the bare minimum of phase 1 in healthy patients, and mostly do a phase 1 in diseased patients, and even determine some kind of efficacy metrics in phase 1, and then skip right to phase 3. All sorts of, there's a bunch of variants on that theme. So, but again, zooming out, a lot of it comes down to the client's preferences and the commercial or business context they're operating in. So again, I'll give you a lot of bookend answers to your question, Will. So it's like, let's say on the one hand, if you have a highly competitive market, you might have to think very carefully about when you design the trials, what are you going to, and usually always when we get to phase 2 and phase 3, these are going to be randomized against some kind of comparator intervention. I should say almost always for most situations. The exceptions would be if there are no approved drugs, it's a really awful disease, you might get a buy on that requirement. But anyhow, you have to think through, okay, what are we going to compare our drug against? Let's say, call our drug the experimental one, because it will matter when it gets out to the market. So if we pick, let's say the number one competitor that's already approved, and we go what's called in a head-to-head design, where every patient's getting randomly assigned to either the best drug out there for this disease or our new drug. Now, if you do that trial and you defeat this standard, this number one standard of care drug, of course it's going to be awesome. You get a lot of patients and market share switching to that new drug because it's going to be the most efficacious. Hopefully, it's going to be the best on these key parameters. But of course, that enriches you for more risk because that's like, again, speaking of baseball, that's like swinging for the fences when maybe you get to market with a single or a double instead. So there's often a lot of calculus that comes down to, again, I'm going to sound like a consultant because I am one, but it's like looking through your options and then helping our clients decide what's the risk tolerance. Again, do they want to go really aggressively, and or do they want to be more conservative? Again, timing is another thing where there are ways to, in a fast-moving market, to get to the market faster by doing a less complex trial. But again, there are always trade-offs. So if you go fast to market, you may have curtailed parts of your clinical trials that doctors and patients would be looking at. So you could get to market faster, of course, in an ethical, regulatory approved manner, but maybe you skipped that randomized trial against the best drug out there. So maybe doctors don't know where to slot you in the paradigm because it's like, well, because as it turns out, trials are, usually if trials are done the same way, and as you mentioned, endpoints, like the same endpoints, same kind of trial design of who gets what drug and for how long, you can kind of compare, but with a lot of caveats. But usually there's a lot of noise, like the trials are not done the same way, or maybe they're done the same way, but the patient, there's like older patients in one trial and younger patients in others. It's like or more severe disease, less severe disease, all these like variables that make it hard to compare. Nonetheless, physicians and patients and advocacy groups will do their best to try because that's the only information they'll have. So anyhow, again, those, if I had to summarize, those are the four dimensions we look at, and a lot of it gets into the fun of thinking about how aggressively you want to get to market, how bold you want to be versus more conservative, and there are different reasons to go either direction.
That's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit more about the kind of work that your firm does. Can you give us sort of just an overview of, first of all, just your firm? I know it's you have several members of the team, and maybe the types of projects you do. Maybe we do a case study or two.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Will. So we're Headland Strategy Group. We aspire to thrive by helping by enabling growth strategy for therapeutics and diagnostics firms, particularly disruptive ones that are really trying to change the game. And as a personal aside, but also speaking on behalf of our staff, this is what gets me up every day. This is what motivates our staff, is to work on cutting edge, groundbreaking medical innovations that are really having real impact in patients' lives. So that's what we do. We have three service areas. One is commercial strategy, where we're basically helping our clients think through how to commercialize. The second is corporate development, including BD and M&A, where we're helping our clients grow through deal making and increasingly grow through fundraising and storytelling around the fundraising. We've had a lot of interest in that in our service offerings. And then the last would be R&D and portfolio strategy, which is how to grow through investing in a smart way to invest in your R&D pipeline. So those are the three areas. Yeah, I mean, what would you like to hear? I'm happy to give some kind of off-the-cuff examples. What would you like to hear about?
Yeah, maybe you could walk us through a sanitized case example of a type of project that you'd do.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Will. So one that's quite common, we're in demand for, is portfolio prioritization projects. And so one example would be a company, and there's more good jargon to share, would be, let's say, a platform company, which means a biotech that has a really cutting edge, cool way to make new medicines. I mean, actually, Moderna would be an example of this. Like for many years been focused on mRNA, and now they're branching out, as you may have seen in the news, to other approaches, but where they have a general approach that's proprietary and they've got the IP around that. And then their question is, well, what drugs should we make, and for which diseases, and how should we prioritize those? So that's a common project we help with. And typically it looks like, if it walk through the phases, there's a identifying where you could go kind of phase, where sometimes our clients might already have the list of, let's say, the top 20 or so diseases they think they could invest in their R&D pipeline. In other cases, they don't know or would look to us to help complement what they've come up with. So do our own research and thinking to come up with additional ideas. And then the next step would be we then go into evaluating all those diseases. And usually it's a rule of thumb, but we like to try to get it down to like the top 10 to 15 most exciting ones. And so we might do a kind of filter if it's a really long list to get down to a shorter list that we can then be very custom. From there, we like to build a custom prioritization framework. Um, Usually it's kind of like a balanced scorecard. And as an aside, a number of us have gotten a lot of advanced training on all sorts of like decision parametric type tools, and have found that at the end of the day, I'd say 90% of strategic decisions on prioritization are really about getting the right set and going through in a consistent manner with the right parameters. Not necessarily all the parameters, just the ones that are going to differentiate. That's always a key and very hard thing to learn. And then from there, getting the answer. And usually don't have to use any fancy ranking or weighting, but occasionally we do if necessary. So then as far as the evaluation itself, and again, we'll be evaluating these investments in basically the 4 dimensions I mentioned earlier, so which were the sort of commercial value, the risk, the cost, and the time. So, and again, depending on the client's urgency and where they are sort of scale-wise, we may go deeper or less deep in certain areas. But then we'll use secondary research combined with our expertise, and or also layer on primary market research, especially, and we typically add that if there's a lot of uncertainty. So say about the new market. So it's one of the cool things about working with innovative medical companies. They're often like breaking one or more paradigms. So they're thinking about a drug that's going to maybe dramatically change clinical practice. If there are major uncertainties, we'll usually recommend doing some primary market research, even really early on, just to sanity check that we're confirming. Usually it's a few key things, but one is like, are the patients we think we'll be able to treat truly, do they really exist? And they're not being happily treated by something else? Is the technology the client going to be really competitive compared to things that are not necessarily on market, but in pipelines already? And those are 2 examples. And then sometimes there's a pricing question too, which it's its own topic, but we might look at early pricing strategy just to get a sanity check about what's going to be, acceptable in the future market. So, and then we'll go through those evaluations and then come up with a recommendation. So at the end of the day, you have a really clear recommendation of the most attractive. Again, it could be diseases to go into, or it could be diseases plus their specific molecules, and you have the rationale. Like, these top 3 are attractive for these reasons, and we can harken back to those 4 parameters I mentioned. Again, value, risk, cost, and time. So I'll stop there. See if you have questions about that.
No, that's helpful. You stay current with industry news. Obviously, you need to when you're serving these innovative clients. Talk to me some about the source of information of how you stay up to date, either podcasts on the industry that you like, or websites, or newsletters, or kind of any other sources of info that you pay attention to.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Will. So with the caveat, and maybe per our last podcast, I have a news diet, so I try not to go overboard. But definitely the short list for me would be Endpoints. That's a great website. There's Fierce, which is sort of sister sites, Fierce Biotech and Fierce Pharma, as well as some med device and other kind of sub-sites within their overall brand. There's Stat. It's like all caps, STAT, which is great. And actually related to Stat, they have a podcast called the Read Out Loud that I think is probably the best biotech podcast I've listened to. And they do a lot of original reporting as well. So they'll like break stories. I really like that crew over there. So those are the short list. I personally, because I have a medical and science background, I sometimes find it's nice to then, I like to, let's say if there's an interesting topic, like there was in the news, some cool new gene editing report out from Feng Zhang at MIT, just like earlier this week. And so I just pulled the original paper through PubMed or through various subscriptions to actually just sit down and read it. And I find that sticks with me better if I actually, kind of old school, but I'll print it out and read the article. So I like to go to pubmed.gov. For free people new to the sector, there's a bit of learning curve to like navigate how to find like a good enough article to read. Sometimes for people who are new, I also recommend Google Scholar, because you can sometimes just get kind of upvoted like the three most relevant articles, and that's a good enough place to start. But that's where I'd start. My staff has they're a bit more news junkies than I, so I know they'd recommend other sources. Oh yeah, I like Seeking Alpha too. That's great for publicly covered companies, and there's a freemium version of that, so you can read about publicly traded companies and what's happening there, and get earnings call data and stuff like that, so you can kind of see. Again, as we were joking earlier, no podcast in biotech would be complete without mentioning Aduhelm. It's like you could pull up Biogen on Seeking Alpha and just read through what investors are asking Biogen about Aduhelm on their earnings calls. So it's quite interesting.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. So we're a full podcast. This has been fantastic. Andrew, where can folks find out more about your firm online? I'm going to share a link. We'll include it in the show notes if you want to, and if you want to give any ways for people to follow up with you individually.
Great, thanks, Will. Yeah, we're headlandstrategy.com. On LinkedIn, I believe it's LinkedIn/headlandstrategy. I should know that off the top of my head, but we've got a pretty strong presence on LinkedIn. And actually, I should. And then you can email me directly, andrew@headlandstrategy.com. And yes,
and we
can upload the link if I've got the URL wrong.
Yeah, no, we'll include the links in the show notes. We'll check it out and make sure we got it right. Andrew, this has been fantastic. Thank you for taking the time to walk me through kind of pharma versus biotech and the work that your firm does. It's great speaking with you.
You're welcome. Thanks so much, Will. Thanks for your time, and look forward to answering any questions if I can from the audience. And yeah, have a great day.